Welcome back. In this video, I want to cover the topic of state and especially the idea of state updates being asynchronous. Let's have a look. I've just started a base Create React project for us. And the only thing I've done up until now is just update this from a function to a class component. Now, what I want to do is just simply change this a tag to a button, and we'll do the same over here. And we don't need any of this. All we need is, well, let's just say here, update state, so that we have an update state button. And then finally, we'll create some sort of state that will display here. And let's just say that we want to create, again, using constructor. We're going to call super, as we always do. And then finally, we'll say this state is going to equal, and let's just say meaning of life is going to be, well, 47. Oh, and make sure I have the proper syntax. And all we're going to do is just display this state up here as this dot state dot meaning of life. So if we save this and we run our server, we should have the meaning of life. But we also want to update the state. So again, in this button, we'll just create, and this is something we've already seen before, right? So this should become second nature to us by now. So we create an onClick. We'll say it's going to be this dot handle click, and we'll create this method on this component right here. We'll say handle click. We'll use an arrow function so that we don't have that issue with the this keyword. And then in here, we'll simply say this dot setState to update our meaning of life. Well, let's just increment it by 1. So what I'm going to do is say meaning of life is going to equal this dot state dot meaning of life plus 1. That's it. So if I save this and go back and I click on update state, I see that my state is updated every time I click. Now here's the thing. As I've mentioned before, the React library helps us manipulate the DOM, but to be efficient and to be fast, it usually batches multiple setState calls, because sometimes we can have in our app multiple setState calls, or multiple locations where we change the DOM. Instead of it calling setState every single time, it sometimes gets smart and says, oh, don't worry, if there's a lot of setStates happening, I'll batch them together and update them all into one single update for performance. Now, in our case, this worked, but React actually does not guarantee that when we call this and we update state, that this is going to work. Why is that? Well, because this call of setState is asynchronous. And what does that mean? It means that when we click on the button, this doesn't happen immediately. When we call this setState, we give control to the React library and we say, hey, you take care of this. You know the best time to update the state for me. I don't care, just do it for me and I'll keep doing something else. So unlike a synchronous call that this happens immediately when we call it, asynchronous just happens sometime in the future. And we actually saw this when Yihua mentioned the fact that if we ever wanted to check the state, let's say after we make this call, let's say we do a console.log this.state.meaning of life. If we did this, we'll notice that this state of meaning of life won't get updated, even though it's called after the setState. Again, if I save and go back and open up the developer tools, you'll see here that when I click this, my state is 48, but it console logged 47. And it's always one behind. And that is because this line runs, we give control to React to update the state for us, but it doesn't do it immediately. It does it asynchronously. And by the time we call this line, the state hasn't been updated. And we saw a way to get around this, right? we can give a second parameter to our setState call, which is our callback. And the callback simply takes a function, so we can just have a simple arrow function here that console logs for us. So if I move this here now, and I save, go back, and I click, you see that now everything is in sync. Okay, so that works. But here's the thing. This is actually bad practice. Why is that? Well, because our app is simple right now, this is working. However, because of the way setState batches work into a single update, like I mentioned, if we had multiple setState calls, it doesn't guarantee that when we increment meaning of life, that this part, meaning of life, will be the latest version. Maybe another part of the app modifies meaning of life to be something else. So because there is no guarantee, there's a rule in React that we have to follow. And the rule is this. If in your setState call, you ever use this.state directly like this, so instead of meaning of life being something that, well, let's say dolphins, where we don't use the state, that's completely fine. And we can just give it an object. But if we ever want to use this.state or this.props in our updates to calculate something, then we should do something instead of what we do here, which is giving it an object. So let's just remove all of this, or we can keep the callback function over here because this could just stay there. The important part is the first parameter. This object, instead of an object, can also be a function. And it's a function that receives two things. One is the state, or to be more descriptive, the previous state. And then the second parameter is the previous props. So if I just wrap this in brackets, since these are the parameters, and we call this function, and in here I do the exact same thing where we return an object. So I'm adding the brackets here so that I don't have to just type in return, so that we can actually return the object here. If I do this, I can say meaning of life and say this.state.meaning of life plus 1, just like that. You know what? Let's put this on a new line just so it's cleaner. So I'll remove the brackets here. And I'll simply say return the object meaning of life just like this. So this whole function is our first parameter, and our second parameter is right here. So if I do this, I now can use this previous state to guarantee that when I update this, this is the latest previous state before the update. So this is just best practice that you have to remember. Anytime you want to update state and there is props or state that you need to use within the update, then you should use the syntax of using a function instead of an object. So in here, instead of calling this.state directly, I simply just say previous state. So if I save this and go back and I click update, you see that everything is still working properly. Awesome. Now, what about this previous props? In order for us to play with this, we need to have some sort of props or properties on this app component. But up until now, we've only seen app be the parent or the biggest higher level component. It's the top of the tree. But as I mentioned previously, state can live anywhere. We don't need to have state in just one component. We can bring it down the tree to another node. We can mix and match. And that's something we'll explore throughout the course. But let me show you how we can get props to the app component. We simply go to index.js where the app component is. And let's say we'll add a increment attribute. And this increment attribute will be, well, what we increment by. Now, if I do here 1, this is going to give me an error. It's going to say, well, I'm trying to do JSX and I have no idea what this means. Because remember, we need to pass it some sort of a value in JavaScript, which means wrapping it in brackets. So this evaluates to a JavaScript expression. If I save this, I now have these props. Now, let's say I wanted to use the props here. So now I'm going to get the increment prop. So I'll just say this dot props dot increment. If I save this, all right, it seems to be working, but let's check. If I update state, all right, this is working nicely. Perfect. And again, if I wanted to just use previous props, I can just make sure that it's the latest and nothing has changed it by using previous props. If I save it, once again, everything is working. Great. Now, one last thing. Usually, it's good practice to put in here in the constructor and super, to put in the props like this. Now, what does this do? This allows you to actually use the props in the constructor. What do I mean? If I do here, this dot props, I can now use this dot props inside of the constructor. So if you ever need to use this dot props inside of the constructor, you need to pass this here. So for example, if I just simply do this dot props equals props, I save it, and I remove the props from here, you'll notice that I'll get an error. Props is not defined because I cannot use this dot props this way. Now, there are occasions when that needs to happen. So it's always recommended that you just add props in case you ever need to do this dot props in here. So let's say, for example, in our state calculation, we want to say that meaning of life is going to equal 47 plus this dot props dot increment. So it'll originally be 48. If we save here, we have previous props here for the increment. If I go back, you see that it's now 48 as the default. So that the next update will be 49. So this is why we pass props in the constructor and super. Now the final thing I want to show you is that Create React App has something called the alternate class syntax. Now, in regular JavaScript, you can't do this. And there are proposals that are going to allow future versions of JavaScript to do this, but you may see them in common React code bases, so I want to show you. Because some people don't like this constructor having so many lines of code. Sometimes a state is just a simple thing. So, for example, if we didn't have any of this increment and we just had the +1 here, and let's say no props, well, we can just remove all of this, like so, and just simply say that state is equal, meaning of life, which equals 47, and that's it. And if I do this, it leaves out the constructor and initializes the state as a class field declaration. Again, this is something because of the Create React App and the Babel compiler that it has underneath. But you are going to see this in some code bases where you just want to set state really easily, but you won't have access to the props inside of here as we did with the constructor. So that if I save this, this should still work, and it does. Keep in mind, state updates are asynchronous, and we want to be careful. The rule is this: do you ever want to manipulate or use the state somehow after the update? Then add in a second parameter, which will be a function where you can use that updated state. Maybe in your update, in your state update, you have to use the state as part of the calculation or the props as part of the calculation. Then you should pass this function form to update the state. Otherwise, you can just use the simple object notation that we've seen up until now. If you get this concept, this is going to take you very far in your career. So hope that makes sense, and I'll see you in the next video.